Nestled in the heart of the Dorset countryside lies the picturesque village of Tyneham. On the 19th of November 1943, the residents of Tyneham would receive an unexpected letter that would change their lives forever.
It was Charlie Beauchamp, the postmaster at Creech Village, who would deliver the news in the form of a sack of official-looking envelopes.
The official-looking envelopes contained a notice to evacuate the village by the 19th of December 1943. The Tyneham Valley was being requisitioned by the army in preparation for the D-Day landings. In the space of 33 days, the villagers would have to pack up their belongings and leave the homes that had been theirs for centuries.
Oh, devastated, because it was people's homes that have been there for donkey's years. And history was there. Well, our history is there because, my grandparents are buried in the churchyard.
The villagers left Tyneham with the hope that one day they would get to return. However, in 1947, the entire Tyneham Valley received a compulsory purchase order from the army. The people who had given up and left their homes in order to win the war to keep men free would now not be allowed to return. Now, Tyneham is a village frozen in time, a unique reminder of, as Rodney Legg puts it, a symbolic loss.
Tyneham has not been without its fair share of political action and controversies, from the Tyneham Action Group to the Dorset County magazine. However, what I am most interested in is how the memory of Tyneham and the events of the past 70 years have had an impact on how it is remembered and its identity.
Tyneham has a substantial history, even before the events of the 20th century. It is mentioned in the Domesday Book under the name of Tyneham. There is a vast archaeological record here, including Bronze Age artefacts and human remains discovered in a mound near the church. The area surrounding Tyneham would have been mostly used for arable farming. Corn would have been grown, with pigs, sheep and cattle all grazing on the nearby landscape. By the time Tyneham had reached the 20th century, little would have changed in that respect.
During the First World War, the War Office began to look for a suitable site to train tank battalions before they departed for France. The perfect location was found in Dorset. In 1916, land was requisitioned on the coast near Lulworth Cove. Tyneham was not 2 miles away, and, as the war progressed, the villagers would have become increasingly aware of the sound of shelling resounding through the nearby hills, ignorant to the fact that within the next 30 years, the army would soon be expanding their training facilities into their valley. By the time that Tyneham had entered the Second World War, the villagers were aware of the existence of a tank firing range nearby. However, they had rarely come into contact with anyone from the military themselves.
On the 19th of November 1943, 2 years before the end of the war, the residents of Tyneham all received a letter from Major-General C.H. from Army Southern Command, informing them that they had to evacuate their homes in order for the army to extend its training facilities even further.
It is regretted that, in the national interest, it is necessary to move you from your homes. The date on which the military will take over this area is the 19th of December next, and all civilians must be out of the area by that date. The government appreciate that this is no small sacrifice which you are asked to make, but they are sure that you will give this further help towards winning the war with a good heart.
The evacuation of Tyneham took place under official secrecy, with the assumption that the villagers would one day get to return home.
The residents of Tyneham were relocated to towns and villages across Dorset, including Corfe Castle, Wareham and Weymouth. It was to be a harrowing experience for all those involved. Now the majority of the villagers who had lived in Tyneham at that time are sadly no longer with us. However, I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to talk to Peggy Reed, originally Peggy Holland, who had lived in Tyneham as a young child until the late 1930s.
Well, I first went to Tyneham when I was about 6 from Bear Regis. And we went to Boltington Cottages.
When you heard about the evacuation, how did you feel about that?
Oh, devastated, because, I mean, it was people's homes that have been there for donkey's years. And history was there. Well, I mean, our history is there, because, I mean, my grandparents are buried in the churchyard.
I have come to Tyneham Theatre to see Mark White, the Tyneham archivist and the grandson of Peggy, to see if he can shed some light on Tyneham in the later parts of the 20th century, in particular, about whether the identity of the village has been lost since its requisition in the Second World War.
So why is Tyneham so controversial even over 70 years after the evacuation?
That I can't really answer. I'm not too sure. For me, it's not that controversial personally. I think it stems back from Churchill's broken promise, the promise to be able to return after the Second World War. Obviously, no one knew the Iron Curtain was going to close and the land would still be required. But I think it stems from the campaigns back in the 1960s, 70s, the fight for Tyneham, with John Gould and Rodney Legg, and it was really that had they not done that, I don't think Tyneham would have been brought to the forefront, and I don't think it would have been as controversial. So I think it's mainly down to the fight for Tyneham that such a controversy arose. I think it's given them more of an identity. When I speak to local people for the first time and meet them, and they find out that my family are from Tyneham, it's like a shock and awe. Really, your family are from Tyneham? That's great. What was it like? And so I don't think they. Some may argue that they lost their identity. Me personally, and my side of the family, we think we gained an identity.
You gained an identity. Do you think there is a loss of sort of memory and identity in Tyneham itself?
Yes, to a degree. Now that the older generation are dying off, the ones that were living here, there's only a handful of villagers left. They are taking their memories with them, and it's a shame we need to capture those memories more. So, to a certain degree, the stories, some of the history, some of the personal stories, that identity will be lost.
It is a sad thing to consider the idea that Tyneham could be losing part of its identity due to the loss of the personal stories. However, I can't help but wonder if Tyneham has taken on a new identity as the years have gone by. I was given the chance to talk to Ministry of Defence archaeologist Guy Solkeld. Over the course of our conversation, I began to realise that a new identity had begun to emerge.
What about as an archaeologist? How do you feel about Tyneham? What do you feel about what's happened to it?
Well, it's a really strange place, isn't it? In some ways it's unique, and in other ways it's not unique. I think you can take wider conservation approaches, so you could have a look and see what the National Trust do, for instance. Historic England, their conservation principles. And Tyneham a sort of place that you can walk around and see how it's been done here and how that compares with how it would be done in other places. You can see, for instance, in some of the structures, I mean, they're clearly ruins, but they're in a sort of stasis, aren't they? From an archaeological point of view, I think Tyneham is really fascinating, actually. It's still in living memory, although that's beginning to fade. And from the point of view of 1943, that's still quite modern for archaeology in a lot of areas.
Modern.
Yeah, I mean, although places like Historic England, for instance, are increasingly looking at Cold War structures and designating those as being worthy of national significance. But there's a point where social history turns into archaeology, and you have to start thinking about archaeological approaches to how you would replace materials, for instance, and carry out maintenance and that sort of thing, and stabilise decay. And that seems to have happened at Tyneham. So that's a fascinating one, really. So there's that side of the archaeology of what was left from 1943. That's one thing in itself. But the report here indicates that there's lots of other archaeology pre-1943 and older than the 19th century, older than most of these buildings anyway, in fact all of these buildings. And what also is interesting about Tyneham is that because it was taken out of normal use in 1943, if you like, subsequently all those things that have happened over the years to the English countryside and towns and villages hasn't happened here. So there hasn't been development. The agricultural changes that came about after the Second World War with deeper ploughing and all that kind of thing, they haven't happened in the landscape either. So what you've basically got is a preserved medieval landscape, potentially. You can look at LiDAR, for instance, and see the landforms. So the potential for undisturbed archaeology, Tynham's past, if you like, and its deep past, is really strong. So by killing off its future, if you like, the MOD have preserved its deep past.
It is a very interesting thought that the identity of Tyneham has changed over time, from that of a small English country village near the Jurassic coast to an archaeological haven yet to be examined. It has become a destination for visitors wishing to see what life was like before the changes that the Second World War had brought about.
Because what will they do with it if they give it back? It'll be turned into a circus. We're going to look at it and viewing it, and they'll be building shops there and all that, and they will take away all its character.
The evacuation of Tyneham village in 1943 and the subsequent compulsory purchase order removed Tyneham of the identity of being a small, picturesque, bustling village in the heart of the Dorset countryside. The requisition of Tyneham prevented the village from becoming, as Peggy said, a circus, and has prevented archaeology from being disturbed through the agricultural changes of the later part of the 20th century. Tyneham has gained a new identity, one that will continue to change and develop as the years go by.